Hey, what is up guys? Today I wanted to share with you my final thoughts on Prey. And if you saw the thumbnail, I'm sure you've already guessed by now that I really wasn't a huge fan of this game. And you'd be right to do so. For me, Prey was a really cool concept, but also one that failed at doing the main things games are meant to achieve, and that's being fun. Now originally I was aiming at getting a full review out much sooner, but it's for this very reason that I kept putting this game off more and more, and by the end I felt as though I had to force myself to trudge through it. Arguably the first hour or so was really well done, but after that, and even more so after the first half of the game, it really starts going downhill. And it turns into one big frustrating mess. It's not just for one reason either, it's more so a combination of several problems and missteps. To put this into perspective, Prey takes place on one big space station, most of which is open to explore and go back to throughout the entire game, granted you have the right resources and the skill or intuition to get into said certain areas. Which, on the surface, sounds cool, and it sets it apart from more linear games, but in the end it also becomes the main source of Prey's repetitive nature. For instance, throughout most of the game you're going to be backtracking and seeing the same places over and over, for many reasons too. You may need something from a previously locked area, or you might just be going back to scavenge for supplies. And supplies in general pretty much become a necessity in some of the later areas, as getting past certain enemies becomes near impossible without a whole lot of them. From my experience, I found the game lasted me about 20 hours, give or take. But keep in mind, about 9 of those hours were just me repeating certain parts and having to respawn due to downright annoying enemies that felt extremely cheap. But we'll talk more about them later. So with those 9 hours out of the way, that leaves us with 11 hours of other content where we're actually moving forward and progressing gameplay wise. So for $60 you gotta ask yourself, is that really worth it? And not to mention, half of those 11 hours were spent backtracking through the same areas I had already been several times before. I'm sure there are some of you who could put up with that, but for me, it did feel unbearably frustrating at times. Now back to the enemies. With these it was sort of hit or miss. The first enemy you come across, or the mimics as they're known, are easily the most well-made and enjoyable to fight. They're what really caused the first hour to be so exciting, because you're constantly unsure of where they are and unaware of what items they may have taken shape of. However, other than them, everything else just seemed annoying, to be honest. Oftentimes I found myself getting killed in what I can only describe as the cheapest ways possible. I would constantly be getting seen or shot through walls, and one-shotted by enemies with the deadliest aim imaginable. To make matters worse, there really wasn't all that much I could do about it, because I would always find myself low or completely out of supplies I needed to bring down enemies and move forward in the story. So from there I would have to backtrack to get even more ammo, which then had to be prematurely used on other enemies the game had repopulated itself with. I imagine these were spawned in to maybe alleviate how boring the devs knew backtracking was, but for me it had the opposite effect and it made things so much worse than they already were. This was all on normal too. I don't even want to imagine what the other difficulties would have been like, because even this felt like playing a Halo game on Legendary times 10. And I could go on, but for the sake of keeping things somewhat short, we'll leave it at that. Prey also desperately could have used some sort of safe house style area that would have allowed you to fast travel across the station. In this case, a station that I almost forgot to mention is plagued with these long loading screens that completely hinder the experience, because you end up getting them so often. Now, having some kind of fast traveling system in there would have undoubtedly made the game a whole lot shorter and easier. And sure, call me lazy for it, but does it really matter when half of what made the game a whopping 11 hours long was so mind-numbingly frustrating? Because of all that, the game became a long and tedious cycle of dying and repeating once again over and over. And maybe I'm alone on this one, but I can easily say this game pissed me off more than any other game has in the past. Which I hate to have to say, because under all of this mess is actually a decent game with polished mechanics and a good mystery for a story. Luckily for me at least, the number of bugs were relatively low, and the game ran extremely smooth apart from hiccups during autosaving. Weapons were also really cool in both their design visual-wise and how they functioned. Though, speaking of bugs, whoever thought it would be a good idea to make it so you couldn't hold your weapon or move straight forward, coming out of the elevator with enemies right outside, would have done a great job at making me snap the disc had I not been on PC. And examples such as these happened all too often as well. They weren't necessarily as buggy, but they always made you ask yourself who the hell thought it would be a great idea to make this part of the game near impossible. But anyways, back to the story. I'll try and refrain from any spoilers, especially since this is one of the game's stronger aspects. The story is no doubt interesting, to say the least. Plus, apart from the main story, you've also plenty of side missions available to you, most of which were fairly enjoyable. Also, what I thought would have been a major downside actually turned out quite well, and was even executed a lot better than its counterpart. And that's the fact that most of the story is given to you or told to you via audio logs, or at times, the occasional video file. And I know it kind of sounds boring, but the voice acting in these was admittedly really great, and did a nice job at grabbing your attention. But on the contrary, whenever you'd meet someone in person, their dialogue and expression just felt extremely dull. And there's nothing worse, story-wise, than just being talked at the entire time. And that's exactly what these moments were. At no point did the people you meet give a shit about what you thought, nor did you have the option to ever respond, making me feel as though this game really could have used at least some kind of dialogue option. And now that's the thing about it. It's almost like the game doesn't really know what it wants to be. Half of it's trying to feel like a great narrative-driven story, following the main character Morgan, and you do get to hear from him occasionally in a couple of old video logs. But then the other half makes him feel like a total empty husk that never speaks at all. Honestly, it would have been way more beneficial to the player had they allowed Morgan to make remarks to himself, or even other people that you end up meeting. And no, him being silent does not make you feel as though it could be you, not the least bit. So if that's what they were going for, I gotta say, it failed. There's really no two ways about it. And you can tell that's exactly what they wanted, because they end up giving you a fair amount of choices to make throughout the game. Hell, you can even straight up kill friendly NPCs if you're evil or maybe just want to speed up certain parts of the story. And in the end, the game takes things like this into account to determine your ending, but ultimately it still falls a little short. Visual-wise, I think you'll either love it or hate it. I will say it did have a unique style that sort of felt like a 60s retro style future, which I know a lot of people will enjoy. And things like weapons, once again, looked really awesome. But to me, the rest of the world as a whole, and especially the character models, looked very dull and dated. Thus, not a whole lot stood out. One more positive note though, music-wise, certain songs sounded really great, so props to whoever designed those. But for reasons I can't explain, the music would always play at random times, most of which were at the worst moments possible. Sure, there were maybe one or two really nice spots where you could tell they had this set up. But only maybe once or twice. And apart from that, it was always, once again, at random and never really seemed to fit whatever was going on at the time. Therefore, even though the music sounded really nice, only a few times out of the whole entire game was it ever allowed to help increase the tension. And because it doesn't get a chance to do so, it always leaves you thinking, man, I wish I could have heard a lot more of that. So all in all, although Prey lays out a admittedly cool concept, that's really all it is. And after finishing it, I don't get the sense that the devs had a real passion for this game, and it sort of feels like they just did the bare minimum. This may be unfair for me to say, considering I wasn't there while they made the game, and maybe they thought they really had a great game on their hands. But that's just my opinion, and I'm eager to hear yours. And hey, if you played Prey and enjoyed it, more power to you. So that all begs the question, should you buy Prey? Well, as of now, I'd have to say no, at least if you're anything like me. But for those of you who have nothing else to do and absolutely have to, maybe wait for the Steam summer sale and then have a buddy over so he could endure all the frustration with you. And you know, if I had to give this game a final rating, it would be a 6 out of 10. It was just painfully average. It has a good story and occasionally some tense moments to be had, buried under the rest of what I would call one big mess. But it's because of that mess that I can't bring myself to give this game anything higher. So let's just say I'm glad to be done with it. And even though I think I'll remember this game for a long while, it won't be for the right reasons. With that being said though, thanks for watching guys. Hopefully you did enjoy the video. And as always, I will see you in the next one.